The roots glistened like veins under skin as the torchlight licked along the chamber's stone. The air smelled of earth after rain, cold and sweet, threaded with the faint copper of old blood and sap. The singer's eyes, leaf green and sorrowful, watched him from the crook of the roots, as if the tree itself had grown pupils and a patient gaze. The old man, what remained of him, peered from a throne of wood and bone, his hair long and white, his hollow cheeks like old parchment. He beckoned with a twig-thin hand. "Drink," he said, voice brittle but wrapped around a strength untouched by winter. The bowl held a paste as red as a wound. Bran's fingers closed around the rim and felt the chill in the wood. The paste smelled like the heart of the gods would at Winterfell, like the steam from the hot springs, like cold autumn and wet leaves and the place in his chest where his father's memory lived. He looked down into it and saw nothing but his own dark eyes. Mira's breath made a white plume in the torchlight. She had knelt by Jojen, who lay bundled in furs, his eyes half closed, his skin so thin that the green veins in his eyelids showed like delicate vines. Hodder crouched behind them both, huge and looming, his big hands fretful on the loops of his pack. Summer lay stretched along the stone, forepaws out, head raised, golden eyes bright and wary in the dark. "Bran," Mira said, no more than a hush. It was not a warning, nor a plea. He heard in that single sound the weight of ice and hunger, the miles behind them, Jojen's cough, the dead rising from snowdrifts, the long nights where he had closed his eyes and felt not his small, broken body but the warm, sinewy grace of muscle and fur. He had also felt the tug from the roots, the whispers skittering across his dreams like winter crows. "Drink," the old man said again. The singer's mouth moved in a soundless word that Bran understood anyway. "Please." He thought of his mother's fingers tangling his hair to pull a knot free. He thought of Arya racing barefoot along the battlements, and Rickon's laughter, and Robb's grin when he had won their wrestling by tricking him with a feint. He thought of the godswood at Winterfell, the sound the leaves made when the wind came up the mists, the slow drip of water, the face carved in red and white, stern as an old lord and yet familiar as his own heartbeat. He thought of being a boy and not a tree. "I can't," Bran said, and the word fell like an axe into quiet. The old man's eyes, pale as old milk, did not seem to blink. "You can," he said, and there was no command in it, only certainty. "You are the one who can." "I am Bran Stark," Bran said, and his voice steadied as he said it, the way a hand steadies when the hilt fits it. "I remember my father's face. I remember my mother's hands around mine. I remember Winterfell. I won't forget them. I won't give them to the roots." The singer bowed her head, and it sounded like leaves moving, a faint, reluctant music. The old man's mouth thinned. "A river does not choose the sea," he said. "It runs to it because the land shapes it so." "Then I will be a pond," Bran said, surprising himself and Mira too, for her eyes sharpened at the word. "Winter holds ponds fast." He set the bowl on the stone, careful and slow. "Teach me another way or none. But I won't drink." The silence after trembled with small sounds. The hiss of the torch, the distant drip, drip of melting ice from some far chamber. Summer's low sound deep in his chest, like a question answered with a growl. The old man raised his hand to his brow and rubbed slowly, thumb against the ridges of bone. "The cold grows," he said at last, each word as if pulled from a well. "The dark is not a boy's tale. A door of green can make light, but doors open both ways." Bran swallowed. He remembered another door, underground and white, and a hand pressed against stone to make it speak. He remembered a copper-sweet smell and a black cloak and a voice choked with fear and duty. "We will go," he said. "If there is no way but that way through the roots, then we will go south without them." He looked at Mira. Her mouth tightened, but she nodded once, crisp as a leaf snapping clean. Hodder made a soft noise, as if the cold had finally slipped through his layers and touched bone. The singer set the bowl aside. Her long fingers brushed the roots around her like a woman smoothing tangled hair. "If you go, you can never come back," she whispered. "The cave will be shut to you. The snow will close, and the dead will learn your scent and the taste of your heat. Then we'll go quickly, Mira said, before their noses are downwind. She lifted Jojen's head and offered him water. He swallowed and coughed, and when he opened his eyes fully for a moment, they were water-clear and unclouded. He looked at Bran and smiled sadly, a boy's frail smile in a face alive with something older. I dreamed this choice, Jojen said. You were a sapling, and the frost wanted you, but saplings bend. Your roots drink where you set them. He closed his eyes again, breath thin and fast. The old man's gaze weighed Bran. Some part of you will always be hungry for the trees, he said. You will hear them in your marrow, a choir under your heart. He made a small gesture and the singer moved away to speak in the old tongue with others who watched from deeper shadows, a sound like pebbles shifted by tiny waves. But go. It may be that the land will still shape you. Thank you, Bran said, because his father would have said it to a man in a hall who had offered guest right even if the bread had been bitter. The words seemed to make the cave stir, a faint breath through an ancient body. For a heartbeat, Bran felt the roots stretch under his skin, a flicker of red leaves across his vision. Then he blinked and it was stone again, torch again, Mira, hotter, summer, Jojen. Cold hands waited near the mouth of the chamber, the smell of his mount's drifty. In like breath through a wound, the musk of elk and something older than horse. He came forward in that soundless glide that made Bran think of ghosts that had learned to be quiet. The scarf hid most of his face, but his eyes shone like wet coals. The wind has turned, he said. We must move. They left the cave while the darkness still felt thick enough to hold. The cold seized Bran's cheeks with both hands and pinched hard. The sky was a clutch of low cloud, and the snow underfoot had the crust that comes from thaw and freeze and thaw again. The trees were black lines clawing at the sky's belly. Summer darted ahead, tail high, then back again to circle hotter and the elk that pulled Bran's sledge. Mira moved with easy balance, Reed's daughter on the ice, a spear on her back and her net thrower slung at her hip. Jojen lay upon another sledge, lashed tight, his mouth open for his thin breath. The elk snorted steam and stamped. The cold had a sound when it blew across stone, like the scrape of a dull knife on bone. Snow hissed under the runners. Bran felt the sledge's rope through his thick mittens, each not a speaking thing under his fingers. The world was stripped to pale and black, two colors of a truth too simple to lie. Cold hands took them east, he said, towards where the wall bent to kiss the sea. There are places there where men and ships make bargains, he said. There is a black castle that looks east, and men who wear crow's feathers keep its gates. Men who look east often learn when storms are coming. Cold hands, Bran said once when summer came to him with a whisper of wrongness in his hackles. Why can't you go through the wall? The man did not look back, only turned his head a little so the wind did not steal his answer. The wall was built to hold out more than giants, he said. Its ice remembers. His elk tossed their heads, ghost light flashing along their antlers. Some doors do not open for men who have forgotten warmth. Bran felt the pull then south. Not like the cave's pull, root to root, but like standing on the tower at Winterfell and watching the green country stretch away, feeling the way the land held his eyes, the way his name fit that land like a hand in a glove. He could taste baked bread for a heartbeat. He heard the rattle of practiced swords on the square. He felt hotter lift him with that grunt that meant affection. He slipped into summer without thinking, and the world brightened and sharpened to sense and the quicksilver of movement. He ran low, toes biting into crust, snowflies spinning up from his paws. The forest spoke in scents. Frozen sap, fox, the stale stink of a bear's den, the sweet iron of old blood. He found the trail that made him uneasy. The dead did not smell of much, but they left a wrongness, old water at the bottom of a well that had never seen the sun. He ran back to the sledges and pawed at Mira's leg, then bounded away and back again. Mira understood. She always did. She signaled Cold Hands with a flick of fingers and moved the party off the shallow path to a stand of spruce so tightly knit they made a wall of their own. Potter's breath came in fogs. Jojen murmured a word, but Bran could not catch it. only felt the shape of it in summer's ear and fur. Dark, green, and low. They hid. The dead came. They did not crunch when they walked. They made the snow seem to fall down into itself, crushed by a weight of winter. Bran crouched in summer's skin, a growl, a thread pulled taut through his body. Mira's hand on his flank steadied him. Cold Hands stood as still as a post, and yet his eyes moved, bright. Hodder's huge hands trembled on the sledge's handles, his mouth round with a word he held like a precious thing. He held it so hard that it didn't leak out. After a time, the snow swallowed the sound of the dead footsteps and swallowed, too, their smell, which was more like absence than any scent. Bran listened until the only heartbeat was his own and Summer's, and then they slid out of the trees and began again. In the east, a faint paleness gathered. The sky there had a different quality, as if the world remembered light. They slept in a dell of dead ferns with snow piled high for walls, and Cold Hands went to find a thing he would not name. Mira sat with Bran under a draped skin and peeled the crust of ice from his boot and rubbed his feet between her hands until feeling returned as pain, and then as prickle, and then as what it was. Jojen coughed and then went quiet, and when Bran crept to him on knees and elbows, he found Jojen watching him with a look as clear as spring water. "I'm not a weirwood," Bran said. Jojen's smile made his thin face milk-white in the dim. "You are winter wheat," he whispered. "It grows in frost. It waits for spring and keeps the soil from blowing away." He shut his eyes. "I dreamed a tower in the swamp with broken stairs, and I dreamed a wolf howling under a tree. The howl called the water to rise around a castle made of bones. And I dreamed of ships that moved like geese lifting from a lake, and one ship had a merman painted on its prow and a fat man laughing inside." "What did the tower show?" Bran asked, and Mira looked over her shoulder, sharp. "Shadows with swords," Jojen said. "You will see and not be seen, but you must stay a boy to do it." Bran swallowed. "Help me stay," he said. Mira's mouth softened. "We will," she said, "and you will help yourself." The nights thickened as they went, and the days were the color of a blade just before dawn. Twice they heard horns far off, notes thin as reed song. Once they saw a line where the snow lay differently, a seam across the world, and Cold Hands spoke no word until they had gone around it. "They set lines of dead things to listen," he said. "Even the bones know hunger." When at last the land fell away and the sky opened, Bran smelled salt cold and a kind of brightness that stabbed even through cloud. The sea lay to their right, an iron mass with edges, ice hugging its stony lip. To their left, the wall rose. It did not look like a man's making. It looked like a frozen waterfall halfway through falling and remembered, all of a sudden, that ice should be still, not motion, so it had stopped, and become a blue cliff that ran to the world's corners. Bran's breath stopped too and then came again in a rush, and he was 8 years old with his mouth open at his first sight of a tourney and the bright flash of a knight's shield. At the wall's edge, where it bent like a knee, a castle hunched. Its towers were squat and stunted, and it wore a skin of rime. Smoke lifted from a hole, faint as a sigh. The banner that hung limp against the windward side was black, the cloth too stiff with frost to stir. The crow of men who rang iron against silence. Eastwatch by the sea had never seen a prince, Bran thought, only storms. It looked like a man who had leaned into the wind so long that he had become the shape of it. They were seen long before they reached the gates, of course. Men on the top of the wall were specks at that distance, and yet their faces were almost visible in Bran's mind. His spear tip lowered a finger's breadth. "The crypt," he said. "What did you see?" It was a sharp question, thrown like a knife. He could have said stone wolves and iron swords. He could have said a boy who whispered to skulls and a girl's name carved small in the base of a statue by a hand that had been impatient. Instead he said, "A place where the dead listen. A place that is waiting." The man grunted. "That's all of US east of here," he said. "Cotter Pike, East Watch by the sea. If you are Stark, there's a letter with your name in it somewhere, I'd wager. The Lord Commander keeps his papers neat, the way some men keep their hair." He jerked his chin. "Get them inside. And the elk." Cold Hands bowed slightly and stepped back. He did not try to pass beneath the lintel. The elk stamped and blew steam. Summer's head turned. The world held its breath for one heartbeat, as if the air had frozen in place. "Not him," Pike said, a quick flick of fingers, not unkind. "Not past the gate. He knows why." To Cold Hands he added, rough and grudging, "You did a man's duty. I will tell him." Cold Hands looked at Bran. His eyes were not warm, but they were not cold either. They were old and lit from behind by something that burned without fire. "Remember what the wind says," he said. "It says very little and very often." He turned, and in a few steps the snow and the air took him. Eastwatch's inner yard smelled of tar and fish and men who had not had enough water to wash. The men moved around them in those purposeful lines that look like confusion to outsiders and like sense to those who live inside walls. A boy with a broken nose helped Mira settle Jojen on a pallet near the fire in a low hall, and a man with a bald head and soft hands brought a cup that steamed and said it was willow tea and meant it. He looked at the wolf the way men look at a storm over the sea, like a thing that might pass or a thing that might eat your house. A raven went up with 4 ties on its leg and a strip of raw fish, the fish a bribe or a kindness, depending on who you were. Pike watched it go and spat again. "Black brothers don't need to like lords. Only listen," he said. "He'll listen, and he'll come." "He can't," one man said behind him softly. "Not if." "He'll come," Pike said, and his eyes cut the man's words into pieces. He looked at Bran. "If he doesn't, I'll know why." He had a way of speaking that made sound do things it had not wanted to do. Bran kept the cup between his hands until the warmth had soaked into his bones and the pain that came with it had become a kind of relief. He did not know how long it was before the horn blew, one long note, then another. Men moved with a different speed then. Summer lifted his head and a low, pleased sound hummed in his chest like a lute string touched by a careful finger. Jon came in with snow in his hair and tight lines around his mouth that had not been there when he had been a boy kneeling in the yard, lights dancing in his eyes. As he watched Ser Roderick's pupils disarm him, he was thinner, and the black looked different on him now, less like a borrowed cloak and more like skin. He stopped in the doorway, and for a heartbeat no one moved at all, as if the hall had been a painting all along that some god had suddenly remembered to animate. "Bran," Jon said, and his voice broke on the name. He took 3 steps and was on his knees in the rushes and had his hand on Bran's nape as if to prove that the neck had warm blood, not sap. "Little brother." Gods. Bran's eyes stung, and he would have been ashamed of that once. Now he let them sting and the tears fall, because they were warm and he was cold. "Jon," he said, "I saw the sea. It smells like rot and life," Jon said, and his laugh was breathless. He put his forehead to Bran's and let his breath mingle. "You stubborn, reckless, brave boy. Have you any idea how?" "Yes," Bran said, and they both laughed then, which made Mira smile where she sat with Jojen's head in her lap. Hotter said hotter, softly, like a blessing. Later, when the first gladness had burned down to a steady coal, the words came that had been waiting like a wolf in the brush. There were letters. There were wars Bran had only smelled the smoke of and tasted in the thin gruel of rumor. There was a girl in a tower by the sea with hair that caught the light wrong. There was a man with a red sword who ate smoke and shadow. There were lords who had called their banners as if they were calling their hounds in after a hunt, and some hounds had not come. There was a boy in the south with a crown, and men with long memories of stark justice. There were ships that brought onions to cold ports and a fat lord with a honey tongue and a list of names he pretended to forget and never did. "Your name is a bonfire in snow," Jon said, voice low, his eyes on the blackness of his cup. "It draws men who need heat. It draws men who want to piss it out." "Rob," Bran said and swallowed. The name was a blade that cut and then cold that closed the wound again and left it burning. "And father," Jon nodded. Winterfell burned, and a man carried its ashes in his mouth and called it victory. Roose Bolton says Winterfell belongs to him by a king's decree and a marriage. He says a Stark is a girl he married to his bastard son. His bastard writes letters like a mad dog, biting, frothing, breaking teeth. The north bleeds under mailed hands that are not yours and not mine. Some wait, some have bent the knee. Some have bent but are looking over their shoulder too. The Manderleys bake bread and plan feasts. The Umbers snarl. The mountain clans sharpen knives. The Neck has never taken kindly to boots from the south. Mira's mouth tightened. The Neck remembers the taste of fry, she said. The Neck remembers everything that sinks into it, John said. It is what marshes do. Bran reached a hand to Summer's ruff and felt the warmth there, the beat beneath the fur. I can go home, he said. It sounded like a spell and a prayer. I will go home. He looked up at John. Come with me. The lines at John's mouth deepened. He laid a hand on Bran's shoulder first, then took it away, as if letting it rest there too long would make it harder to move. I can't, he said, and at once Bran thought of the cave and the roots and the old man and how the word can and can't were a kind of binding. My vows are my skin. He hesitated. But I can send men with you to the end of our world. The men I trust. Eastwatch will have a ship to take you along the coast, White Harbor first, perhaps. Lord Manderley is a great lord. And clever. He knows pies and politics. He would not turn away a Stark. Or if you would have me send you to the marshes. He looked to Mira. To my father, Mira said. We can go by water through the Neck. Men who aren't crannogmen sink there unless we hold them up. Greywater watch moves. You cannot take it by horse. There is safety in that. Your father, John said, and something like relief or hope flickered through the tiredness in his face. Was with my father once at a tower. He knows things other men guess and are killed for guessing. If he will hide you, he will also counsel you. The north is tinder, Bran. You are a spark by being alive at all. Be wary where you fall. That night the wind came in from the sea, hard and salt, and rattled the shutters and made pipes sing in the walls. Bran dreamt he was under snow and the snow was under him too, and the world tilted back and forth and back again. When he woke, the tilt was not in his head. The ship was rolling. They had put out by dawn. Eastwatch shrank behind them like a black tooth in a giant's broken jaw. The sea lifted and sank and lifted, indifferent to men's plans. The sailors moved around them like men who had forgotten any other kind of ground, and their oaths were soft and terrible, with a poetry all the more because they did not care if anyone heard them. Mira stood near the bow and worked oil into her net until it gleamed in lines like spider silk, and Jojen lay lashed and swaddled and paler than he had been, though his breath came easier now, away from the dry cold. Hodder looked sick for one day and then fell in love with the sea when he discovered the trick of leaning and the comfort of its regular betrayals. Summer hated it at first and then learned to fix his gaze on far things until the deck's treachery could not trick his balance. They sailed along a shore that sometimes was a line, sometimes a series of teeth, sometimes a hand with fingers thrust into water, grasping nothing. Bran watched for the weeping water and the flint cliffs because the names were stories he had been told in a castle with hot springs and tapestries. He did not always know which was which, but he liked the knowing of names even when the things would not sit still for them. Once they saw smoke from a farmstead a mile inland, and once a trail of lights like sparks thrown from a GR. Eat Forge, moving slow where a caravan threaded the shore road. The captain, his name was Toller Pike's cousin, he said proudly, though he said cousin like it might mean anything from blood to barroom, pointed with a thick finger and named little villages that belonged to men with bigger names, and named coves where smugglers came to count their coins by moonlight. At White Harbor they did not put in. Voices shouted across the water, full of rumor like baskets overfull with fish. A lord had held feasts and sung songs and smiled and taken boats upriver. A different lord had threatened him and then eaten his meat. A southern queen's men had been found in an inn with their throats neatly opened like purses. The merman banners went up and down and up again. The harbor smelled of onion and apples and the deep dark sweetness of fish too long dead. It looked fat and wary. Not here, Mira said to the captain and to Bran. This is a city of knives and napkins. We will dine there later, when we can choose which side of the table we sit on. The captain laughed and pocketed coins with the casual speed of a man who had counted his fingers and found them all. The Neck for you then, he said. Water on water. You'll be home before your enemies can read the map. The mouth of the white knife opened before them, wide and unsuspecting looking, though men said the river had drowned more than it had carried. They sailed upriver while the banks closed in, from flat country with stubbled fields to land all reeds and willow and water under water. Trees leaned in and the river's surface picked up leaves and dropped them again as if idly. The air changed. Salt fell away and a green smell rose, layered and layered until Bran felt it sit in his chest like a frog waiting to croak. The cries of water birds wove through the day and the evening and the night. Fog came up at dusk with all the confidence of a lord coming to his own hall. Greywater Watch did not appear out of the mist. It simply found them when it wished, as if the tower had been walking quietly alongside the boat the whole time and had only then decided to make itself visible. It rose green-gray and low, not tall and proud like Winterfell, but squat and damp and very nearly alive. Its stones looked slick to the eye, and yet the men who waited on its steps stood easy, feet sure. They wore leathers that had seen water more than fire, their hair bound back in the old style by strings that had grown dark with sweat and swamp. Mira went ahead, and branched reeds underfoot broke with a sound like bones. A man came down the steps as if he walked on a floor he trusted beneath a roof he trusted too. He was neither old nor young. His hair dark as a glossy duck's wing and his face lined in ways that made it hard to tell if he had been often angry or often amused or often both. He looked first at Mira, and his mouth softened. Then at Jojen, and his eyes shuddered and opened again like something that rusts and rarely moved. Then he looked at Bran, and his gaze deepened the way a pool looks small on the surface and then is not. "Howland Reed," he said, and that was both introduction and a kind of taking measure. "You stand in the neck, Brandon Stark. The ground here will not hold men who do not learn to tread light." He looked at Mira again. "You bring your guest far. You bring your brother home." "Father," Mira said, her voice as soft as cat's paws on boards, and he went to her in 3 ordinary steps and laid his hand along the side of her face. She leaned into it like a leaf turns to water. When he turned to Jojen, he did not touch him, only looked at him the way men look at a thing in the distance that they must reach and do not know how. "You dreamed," Howland said. "I dream," Jojen said, and coughed, and smiled again, that fragile smile that looked so much like Mira's. It made Howland's mouth go hard for a breath. Then he put that aside. Inside, the air was wet and clean, smelling of fish cooked without apology. The tapestries were made of painted leather, scenes of bog and treachery and mirth. Men and women moved like water, going around what did not move easily without fuss. They made a place for Jojen in a corner where the walls met and the reed mats were thickest. A woman with strong wrists brought hot broth with bits of onion and eel in it, and another wound new leather around Bran's hand where the rope had rubbed his palm until it blistered and then broke. Howland came when the bowls were empty and the boats outside were nothing but a sound. He sat across from Bran on a low stool, his knife at his hip, his eyes steady. "You have the look of your father about the brow," he said, "but your eyes are more like your mother's. The South looks out of them." "My father never spoke much of you," Bran said, then realized it sounded rude and added, "He told us about your people. He said the neck saved the North 100 times without anyone counting. He said the only thing that stopped men from roaring in and taking whatever they wanted were reeds and frogs and people who knew how reeds and frogs worked." Howland smiled briefly. "Your father did not know how to lie when the truth would do," he said. "He did not know how to lie when a lie would do either, most times. He had other gifts." He looked to Summer where the wolf lay with his head on his paws but his eyes open, the way the reeds lay flat in a strong wind but never let go of their roots. "My daughter says you left the green school to be a boy in the world. That is a boldness I respect. Boldness is either foolish or wise depending on what result you live to see." "The dead," Bran said. "They move. They listen. The cave would have made me a root. I would have seen and not been. I wanted to be and do. A Stark's curse is to be a Stark," Howland said. "The land expects it. The men expect it. The children and the old women and the shepherds who watch the edges of the wood and think the wolves are both terror and blessing, they expect it. The shore expects it. The trees. Your name is a promise you did not choose to make. Bran held his gaze. I choose it now. They looked at one another a long time, and in that time Bran thought he saw the edges of a different thing in the older man's face. A story that had a tower in it and red mountains, and cries that could never be repeated properly because the voice that had made them had been too full. Howland leaned back a little, and the sound of water against stone came in through a slot window, regular as a heartbeat. There is a truth I have been the keeper of, Howland said. A truth that lives in your blood, and another's. Over it lies a blanket of winter. I have kept it covered because men burn what frightens them or what they suppose could warm an enemy. He tapped the hilt of his knife with one finger and watched Bran's face to see how much he understood. The dead do not care about such truths. The living care too much. A boy with your name will find a time for that blanket to be pulled. But not now. Now you must be flint and tinder and a patient hand. Bran felt something stir in him that was not a vision, exactly, but the shape of one. A room in a tower, a woman's hair spread like a pool of ink, a hand sticky with blood and a sword on the floor, clean as if someone had remembered to wipe it as a kindness. He looked at Howland and understood that there were threads that wound from that tower to Winterfell's kitchens, to Jon's tired eyes, to a red woman singing at a cold altar, to a man with a fat laugh who ate grief with meat. He let the shape pass through him like cold water and left it behind because the shore here demanded other attention. Help me, he said. Help me go home. I will, Howland said simply. But understand, home is not a tower of stone and hot springs. Home is people who accept your voice. He leaned forward. Roose Bolton holds Winterfell by decree. He will leave it to fight or huddle. His bastard will reek. Some men will do as they are told. Some men will look at their wives and think about the last time they saw their children smile and will not do as they are told. The Manderleys play a long game with pies and oaths and courtesies. The Freys are a knife that men forget they put in their own boots until it cuts them behind their knee. The mountain clans have always been their own men. The Umbers are split like a log with a wedge in it and men pounding with a hammer on both sides. The Karstarks mew around meat they cannot swallow. We do not have to punch every man's nose to know which ones will bleed on us and which will bleed on our enemies. He tapped his knife again. We will cut away what we cannot eat. We will eat what we cannot cut. We will send fish to men who forget they are hungry until they smell it. You will be seen where you cannot be caught. Your wolf will hunt for us. We will learn Winterfell with our feet and our nostrils. The neck moves like water, Bran. We do not break. We drown. It began, then, in a way that did not look like beginning. Messages went out on reed boats that hugged the bank so tightly that the moss brushed men's hands. Men set nets not for fish but for men, and found both. A barge of Freys bound upriver with casks of wine and a chest of southern coins went missing among the lily beds near Ramsgate. Later, 2 Frey shields washed up many miles downstream, nailed together to make a raft, and on them was painted a crude wolf that looked like a child's drawing and a promise. In the green gloom, crannogmen whispered and moved and lay in water with reed straws in their mouths and breathed like frogs until horses went by, and then they rose like the fens themselves and cut hamstrings and throats. The song of the neck had never been fit for harps. It was fit for wet knives. Bran learned the neck with his hands out, like a blind boy feeling a room to make it his own again. He learned where the bottom dropped away when the surface lay smooth. He learned the difference between the gleam of fish eyes and the gleam of a snake's. He learned to sit at night with his back to stone and follow the sounding of frogs and know where men were by where the frogs were not. He learned to be summer when summer hunted and to let go the mind that wanted names then and let the green world be itself, not a list. When he returned to himself he had a better map inside him of the neck and of Bran. Sometimes in the long afternoons when the mist thinned out and the sun turned the water in the shallows to coins, Jojen would sit propped against a wall and watch him with that clear gaze. Mira's laughter would lift like a bird from the yard below. Hodder would be humming to himself as he patched a tear in his winter cloak where a spear had found it and not the meat under it. "You are staying," Jojen would say. "I can feel the trees," Bran would say. "That is what staying is." Jojen would reply and smile. and cough until his head bent, and Mira would come up with her mouth set and rub his back with a hand that had eel slime under the nails. There was less of Jojen as the days were counted. The marsh air took some of his cough and gave him steadier breath. His dreams did not lessen. "Stannis," Jojen said one morning when the fog had blown clear for the first time in a week, as if the world had decided to show its bones. "A king in the snow, with banners that hang stiff and a sword that smokes in the cold. A man with yellow eyes who has lost more than he owns. A tree blazed that should not have burned. Will he come to Winterfell?" Bran asked. "Men speak as if they could summon mountains by wanting them moved," Jojen said. He smoothed his blanket with thin fingers. "He will come as far as he can make men go with him. He will need a wind. He will need food. He will need a name to march behind that is not his own. Names are banners. Men follow cloth when they are cold." "Then our cloth," Mira said later, when they sat with Howland in the room with the eelbone carvings. "No hunter goes out with a whole skin showing. We give them a patch." Howland nodded. "To give a patch, you must lift your head. It is time." He looked to Bran. "You will be seen, but not where the Freys will know where to put a knife." They chose a place on the edge of the marsh where the land thought it could be firm and the neck had not yet taught it a lesson. The ruins of an old watchtower rose there, leaning like a man who had drunk too much and The watchtower remembered a time when river bands had been held by men with wood spear and boar teeth necklaces and hair like river weed. It had watched highborn banners ride too. It would watch again now. They spread the news as if it had gotten loose from a man's mouth without permission. A Stark boy, a wolf, a meeting not for banners but for men who had decided how much of their fear they owed to their children and how much they owed to their pride. The news floated on fish and on women's gossip and on the kind of stories told in a field when men believe no one else is listening because the wind has gone somewhere else. They came in pairs, in threes, in fives, some through water that kissed their boot tops and then slowly decided boots were merely a suggestion. They came with spears and with knives and with empty hands that meant they had hidden their knives where no one could see. They came with questions in their eyes and hope behind their teeth like a bit they were determined not to chew through too quickly. The sky was low and patient. Bran sat on a stone with Summer at his side. He wore a cloak pinned with a running wolf, not because he believed the pin made him lordly but because the men needed the shape of it to focus their looking. He was smaller than the cloak and younger than the expectation in the air, and his legs were under fur and leather. He had not grown into the way that other boys had grown into theirs. He was Bran anyway. They watched him and then they bent their heads and looked more soberly at Howland Reed and his men and the way the crannogmen moved and breathed, and then they looked back at Bran and saw him again as if for the first time. Men judged what they could take and what they could not. The mountain clans sent 2 old men with bearskin coats to sniff and taste. The Serwins, cautious, sent a man with a copper armband and a mouth set like a trap. The Tallhearts sent a cousin who had lost 3 sons and 1 ear. The Manderleys did not come, but a skinny boy wearing the merman on a bit of ribbon in his coat came with a basket of smoked eels and a letter folded so many times it looked like a white flower. Howland read it and said only, "Pies," and put it in his belt. The first man to speak was of middling rank and middling boldness, which meant he was the best to say what the rest thought. "My lord," he said to Bran, trying the sound out in his mouth like a new apple, "we have heard talk. The Dreadfort's men," he coughed. "Bolton men, I mean. They say your sister." He did not finish, and Bran was glad. He did not know which sister they meant. "They lie," Bran said, and it felt like a weight sliding right when it had begun to slide left. "They will lie again. I will say this only once. The Starks do not belong to the Boltons, and Winterfell does not belong to men who burn and flay. Winterfell belongs to the people who buried their dead in its crypt with iron swords to hold the dark down." "Words," a man growled. He had a scar down his cheek like a red ditch that had healed and in healing had forgotten to fill properly. "Yes," Bran said. "Words. Words tell men where to go. These words, I am going home. If you come to free and to rebuild, not for a feast or to write songs. There will be neither until the work is done. If you are too afraid, I will not curse you for it. Fear is a kind of wisdom, If you are too proud to come bent and come proud instead, stay away. Pride eats children the way winter eats the last leaves. If you would rather be a child of Winterfell than a man of the Dreadfort, then listen. Howland lifted a hand, and the murmur hushed. We do not take Winterfell back with banners and drums, he said. Not while a flayed man sits inside it with his ears open and his dogs hungry. We take it back with water. We take it back with patience. We take it by taking away its skin, a strip at a time. We take it by finding its bones. The winter town has back ways. The wells run hot with springs men often bathe in and rarely think about. There were tunnels once for coal and wood that men were too proud to keep because they thought their walls made them safe. The crypts under the castle are older than any lord living. They know paths no living man remembers. The neck knows. We will ask the earth to give them back. Ask a king to go lower than rats. Someone spat from the back. Mira moved like a shadow to stand where the voice had come from, but Howland's hand stilled her as if he had reached out and touched a thread. You can ask a river to run uphill and it will refuse you, Howland said, mild as weather. You can ask men who love their children to crawl through a tunnel if it means those children will see the sun on their hair in summer again. They will go. The scarred man lifted his chin. I will go, he said. Not because I love tunnels, but because I love to hear Bolt. He paused and swallowed. To hear Bluster die. My son died screaming inside the Dreadfort. I will hear no more men scream for them. Tell me where you need my knife. The first, and then the second, and then the third. Names gathered like stones in a wall. Bran listened to them until his ears rang with them. He imagined writing them on the inside of his skull so he could not forget. He remembered how names of wolves were whispered to children so they would not call the wrong one and see yellow eyes too close to their faces. He would not see all the wrong men. They began to pull Winterfell apart before they ever touched it. Free riders went north and west and east like nettles on the breeze. Every bolt of cloth bound for the Dreadfort was chewed by rats that knew which sacks to chew. Every letter to a certain steward in Winterfell's service was copied with mistakes and sent on anyway. A man in the Wintertown broke his leg falling from a roof where he had been fixing tiles and was later seen walking just fine in a village a day's walk to the south with a different name. A woman with a mouth like a line and hands like willow roots in a peat bog cooked a feast for the bastard's men and then led 3 of them into an alley with a joke and came out again alone, wiping her hands on her apron. Far to the east, men said, a king sat in snow and watched a lake harden to stone he could step on. Somewhere a fat lord made pies. And then the snow came down thick as new sheep's wool, and what men had been doing turned from whispers to silence because even the greatest clamor becomes small when the sky decides to put its thumb on your head. The world narrowed. Men walked hunched like old women. Summer prowled through drifts that made him look like a river in a field of white. Men grew irritable from cold and hunger, and cheeks split, and hands chapped, and the simplest knife cutting became a trial. Bran's joints ached until he wanted to bite his own lip to make a different pain. They gnawed dried meat and told tales that kept their minds from counting their toes too often. In that narrow world, a miracle came like a thing that had struggled along behind them for miles and finally found the breath to call their names. It came ragged and limping and haggard, with a girl beside him who had a face cracked with cold and a will under the cracking that had not broken. The man's hair was brown-gray and one ear had been torn so long ago that the scar was white, but his eyes were blue and hollow in a way that had nothing to do with weather. He stumbled into the outer court of Greywater Watch and would have fallen but for Hodder's soft surprise and big hands. Theon Greyjoy, Mira said quietly, and then louder, so the men around them heard it before their hands did something their better minds would regret. Theon of Pike. And the girl. The girl looked at them with a ferocity that had been scoured down to essence. She had hacked her hair. She wore a dress that had been meant to be rich and had become a rag of a mask. Meat had been torn from her hands by cold and rough use, but she held herself like a blown reed that would not snap. Arya Stark, she said, and Bran almost rose and ran the way a boy runs to his sister when he has not seen her in a lifetime. But Summer's growl cut him like a whip crack and his own eyes cut him too. You are not my sister, Bran said, and the girl flinched as if the words were a lash. She looked at him in fear and anger and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "I'm not," she said, her voice breaking, "but I had to be." They learned her name later and learned the circumstances of her being made into a likeness. And the story filled the hall like a bad smell nobody had the rudeness to remark upon and nobody could ignore. Men muttered and spat. Theon sat very still with his hands in his lap, as if he dared not show his palms in fear they would confess a crime of their own volition. He seemed smaller than the chair. Bran watched him, and something inside him that had tried to become a hard seed suddenly softened, inconvenient as melting in winter. "I knew you once," Bran said to him when they were alone as a lord's hall allows. "You smiled with too many teeth and did tricks to make boys laugh that made the men frown. You rode well. You killed our stable dogs. He stopped. Words made stories, but they did not always make a thing whole. You made choices." Theon closed his eyes. "And my choices made me," he whispered. "A joke in a monster's mouth. A tool in a monster's hand. A traitor to my own skin. I did not know there were places even lower than I had crawled. Then I found them. I own what I did, but I would pay down the debt if I can. I will die for you if that is the coin you want." Bran looked at Summer and Summer looked back. He remembered very clearly the smell of cooked meat in Winterfell's great hall and the crackle of fat and the way a boy's laughter fills a space, the way absence empties it. He also remembered a boy riding before him on a saddle made by men who loved him. Lights in the yard that moved like fireflies when seen through tears. "Live," Bran said. "Live and pay. That coin spends longer." Theon stared at him in a way men stare at a thing they had not believed existed. He nodded slowly, and his hands, which had been still and curled as if gripping iron, opened and closed and opened again, like a man on a deck, learning to stand. The story of the false Arya and the true captivity went out on the same water paths that carried eels in and gossip out. It went where it needed to go. Ramshackle men warmed themselves at fires in woodsheds and passed it along with their skins. What it did in other men's halls Bran could not see and did not try to force himself to know. He held to the work at hand. The first step into Winterfell was not taken by Bran, or by Howland, or by a mountain man whose beard had seen 3 winters without a comb. It was taken by a boy of 13 with a back like a willow and a memory for rhythms. He had worked in the winter town sweeping stones as long as he could carry a broom. He knew where the frost seized the paving stones and where the paving stones hid the frost. He knew that the bathhouse servants were lazy on nights when the wine had been good in the hall, and that the man who kept the woodpile was fond of a widow who lived 2 doors down a lane that could not decide whether it wished to be a lane or a ditch. He went to the bathhouse with a BA. Sket on his arm and a handful of dried wild mint for the big copper kettle, as if he were there to sweeten steam. He whistled a tune a grandmother's bones remembered and a guard at the door did not. The guard had been out on the battlements all night and his eyelids had thoughts of their own. The boy slipped past and into a room where the steam rose and skewed perspective and softened edges. He put the mint into the water, and he also put a thing he carried in his sleeve into the notch behind the big tub, where hot water ran away into the beginnings of a tunnel that had been built when the old lords had thought baths a necessity and not a luxury. He went back out whistling and did not hurry because he knew when to hurry and when to turn his footsteps into river time. That night a man in the winter town with hands that knew how to be gentle with old stone took up a tool and worked in a place where no one would see him. Men went down and came up again wet to the waist and grinning through chattering teeth. And the next day a woman with a mouth like a straight line made a stew with more fat than had seemed possible in these thin days and sent a bowl of it to the Dreadfort man who kept the keys to the storehouse because she was a woman who did not hold grudges when the world itself held them so very well. That night the man slept, and 3 men with reed-wrapped feet stepped into the storehouse and did not take what they wanted. They took what a man had counted for an army. They dumped it and replaced it, and when the Dreadfort men salted their meat next day, they salted it with a salt that had been laced where it would do no quick harm but slowly made men forget to stand when dogs came close. Over days the dogs grew slow and stupid. Then one night they did not bark. Bran listened to reports with his hands folded in his lap because folding them let him know he had them. He did not send riders in the day. He sent women with baskets and boys with sticks and old men who had no teeth and laughed at men who thought that meant they could not bite. He sent crannogmen who surfaced under a boat and upset it with a push of a flat palm. He sent gentle-faced men to cut ropes. He sent men with hard eyes to cut throats. He sent a girl who could lie without blinking to offer to warm a certain steward's bed, and sent a boy with ink stains on his fingers to copy a list of stores while the steward's mouth lay open on a pillow. He did not go himself, and that was the hardest thing because he wanted to place his palms on the stone of Winterfell, to press his forehead to it the way men press their foreheads to the bark of a tree they love. He wanted the smell of the hot springs. He wanted the crypt to speak to his bones. But he stayed because that was what a Stark does when the land needs him in one place more than another. Instead, he went there in summer when summer saw, and he ran along the inner yard and peed on a pillar because that was a thing a wolf does to say mine. It startled him to discover that marking could be a prayer. The day they chose, the sky was thin and high, and the air had that quality it gets just before snow. Expectant as a hall waiting for the first lute string to be plucked. Men and women had moved like water for weeks, and now the water would freeze where they wanted it. Inside Winterfell, the fewer Dreadfort men remaining stamped their feet and shouted at one another more than at the servants, because the servants had learned to be invisible and also to be everywhere at once. They came from below. The first men entered through a tunnel that had only ever known the footfalls of woodbearers and kitchen drudges and lovers. They were crannogmen mostly, because men who had lived on water all their lives are not often frightened of dark places that run under walls. Mira went first because she had said she would, and Howland did not tell his daughter no when she had already decided where she would put her feet. She moved like a cat that had found itself a fox den and did not wish to wake anyone unnecessarily. Behind her came men who had names like Frog and Eel and Mud. Behind them came the scarred man who had said I will go, and he had brought 2 sons of other men with him, and their eyes were bright and too wide and not wide enough. Bran waited. He waited in the watchtower that leaned like a drunk, with summer beside him breathing slow and steady and warm. He listened to the way the wind slipped across the broken stone, and he listened to the birds. He put his hand on the stone and promised it he would come. He did not know if stone could hear, but he wanted the stone to know. Howland sat beside him with his knife in his lap and his eyes half closed. Mira had kissed her father's cheek before she went down, and her mouth had trembled for the first time since Bran had known her. And Howland had pretended not to notice because fathers sometimes give their daughters one courtesy more than the world will. The dead did not come that day. The living did unspeakable things to each other. Men died in tunnels without light the way fish die under ice, quiet at first and then not. A door that had never wanted to open went off its hinges with a metal scream that men remembered later in their dreams. And a dog that had not barked in a week finally found his tongue just in time to take a knife in it. A handful of Dreadfort men stood in the yard and realized in the same breath that none of the men behind them had moved to support them because those men lay on their faces in narrow spaces under the earthen floor of a smokehouse, eyes open to dirt that had never seen light. Bran went to Winterfell not through the front gate but through Summer's memory. Summer ran into the yard like daybreak, and the men who should have been ready for him were hefting buckets because it had begun to snow in that kettledrum way that makes men think first of roofs and only later of knives. A woman in a butcher's apron. Anne wept as she set her hand on the hilt of a man's sword to ease it from his clenched fingers, and her tears froze in tracks on her cheeks. A boy in a kitchen stained his hands another color and would not wash them that night when his mother told him to. Bran entered the gods wood by the old way men who have never been caught as boys used to slip out to meet a girl. He rolled under a bough and found his face full of the smell of pine and the clear cold scent of water overturning the winter skin the springs put on themselves. When he rolled again and looked up, 1,000 ghosts looked back at him in the weirwood's face. But they were not angry ghosts. They were watchful. He pulled himself to the foot of the tree and set his palm against the bark. He had to press hard to feel it through the callus and the cold, and then he did feel it. It felt like nothing, like smooth carved wood, and then it felt like a beat, like something very far under the earth striking time, not with regularity, but with a rightness that made the hair on Bran's arms stand. He leaned his forehead to the bark and breathed in the blood sweetness and the leaf rot and the steam of the springs. He closed his eyes, and for a moment there was nothing but red and white and green dark and the sound of water in the next world. He saw then. He did not mean to. He had refused the roots, but the tree was Winterfell's and he was Winterfell's. The vision took him the way a shadow covers a pond when a cloud slides over the sun. He saw a man with hair black and eyes gray set his sword against the roots and kneel. He heard the whisper of a woman's dress as she came to him and laid a hand on his shoulder and knew him for his mother. He saw two boys swearing to be brothers because their lord fathers had told them to, but they had chosen it themselves anyway. He saw a girl with hair like a field of corn lean against the tree and cry because a man had called her wild and in the next breath said he loved it. He saw a little boy chased around the trunk by a girl with a stick, and the boy slipped and cracked his lip and the girl laughed and then kissed the bead of blood and swore him to silence. He saw men with torches and men putting out torches and men kissing dirt and men kissing each other's cheeks before leaving for wars where some of them would be buried under other dirt far away. He saw his father carve a chip from the trunk to have a splinter in his pocket when he went to war, and he saw his father put that splinter back when he came home because he had promised the tree he would return it. He saw light on snow. He saw summer in the leaves. He saw the night his father had brought him here the first time and put his hand where Bran's hand lay now and said, in a voice that had lost none of its authority and gained nothing but warmth, remember. The vision left him with tears on his face that he did not wipe. The snow was falling now in the godswood in flakes so fat that they piled on the branch like birds. He opened his eyes and Summer's head was on his knee. He stroked the thick fur where it always parted a little and never would lie down. Mira came into the godswood with blood on her sleeve. Not her own, he saw at once, which let part of him breathe. It is done, she said. For now, there will be men who will ride here to take it back and men who will say we stole it, because men talk about theft when what they really mean is that someone else has taken what they thought they owned. But the walls and the wells are ours. The kitchens are ours. The dogs are dead or our friends. The banners we have taken down, and the ones we have put up are wolves. The crypt is closed and listening. Howland? Bran asked. He stands by the gates counting men, she said, mouth quirking. He likes counting. He says it turns men into more than a rumor. Bran laughed without meaning to. He placed his palm one last time on the weirwood. I am home, he said, the words to himself, the tree, the air, to whatever might be listening under the snow. I have come home. In the days that followed, Winterfell was a wounded animal under his care. He moved through it as a boy and as a lord and as a body that thought differently about itself now that it had remembered stone. Every corridor held a memory. Not all were welcome. He let them come the way he let pain come, and then judged whether to own each one as part of him or to set it aside as something that belonged to another life. He sat in a chair shorter in the leg than it had been and listened to men argue about whether the main gate should be barred or left open to let the town sense there was no new master closing them out. He sat in the kitchens and ate bread that tasted so much of Winterfell, he had to leave the room and breathe in the cold because he had nearly drowned in memory. He went to the ramparts where he had once run and looked across the white and knew where the river would be when it thawed and where men would stand to catch fish on a day the wind was kind and where a certain farmer's fence would fall again under the weight of snow because no one had ever taught that man how to set a post in winter. Letters came and ravens with broken tails, and men came with mouths full of news like crows with beaks full of shiny things. Not all useful, not all true. They came, too, with offers. A lord in the south of the north offered men if he could marry a daughter to a name. A man with a fur collar like a beast's tail offered grain if the Stark boy would put his name to a paper. A certain fat lord sent a short letter that said only we eat and remember and 3 merman seals. Bran did not know what all of it meant yet. He knew enough to bring it to Howland and to listen while Mira said her piece, and to send birds back with words that were true enough to hold without being so true that they could be turned. One night when the snow had decided to pause a while, as if even it knew the land deserved to raw breath, Bran went to the crypt with a lantern and Summer and Hodder. Hodder carried the lantern high and looked afraid in that open way that made his fear noble rather than shameful. They went down the steps that had been carved by men who had set their strength against stone and had felt proud to leave marks. The air was colder than the cold above, and the smell was of dust and iron and old patience. Bran's breath went in small drifts in front of his mouth. He set the lantern where it would cast light into deeper darkness and sat a long time and let the names of the dead run through him like a song with more verses than a man could learn. He did not call to the dead. He did not ask them for anything. When he spoke, he only said, "We are here." It seemed to him that a breath of air moved along the corridor then, but it might have been nothing, or it might have been everything. On the 7th day after the taking, the wall watch called down a sight, and men came to the battlements with mouths that tried not to smile before their hands knew what their mouths were doing. Bran had the ladder set and was hoisted to the top with ropes and grips he had designed in his dreaming nights to make stone kinder. He looked out over a plain that had been scoured by wind into ripples like the sand of a drained river. In the distance, small shapes moved. He took the bronze tube Howland had found in some lord's trunk and set it to his eye awkwardly, and then found the knack of it. He saw men in furs and a standard that had been mended and mended again, and a star that had not been born from any northern womb but had force enough to keep riding anyway. "He comes," Bran asked, and his mouth went dry. "He comes," Howland said, "and hungry and thin, and with men who have learned to march in snow and men who have learned to die in it." "Stannis," Mira said, tasting the south on her tongue and finding it tolerable. "What will he do?" "What kings always do," Howland murmured. "He will claim and demand. He will offer. He will threaten. He will measure. He will try to make you cloth for his shape." Bran watched the slow, determined approach. He felt the roots in him stir, not the cave's coaxing roots, but the roots of Winterfell itself, sunk into ground that had watched kings come and go and had not moved for any of them, only altered how it threw their voices back. He touched the stone at his side with his palm, and it felt warm, though the wind cut his cheek. Summer sat beside him and watched too, tongue out a little, almost a smile in his wolf way. When the king came to their gates, he came under a sky so white it hurt. His standard drooped like a wet thing in the stillness. The men who rode with him looked as if they had been carved from candles 3 days ago, and were now nearly burned to their wicks. There was a woman with red hair whose eyes took everything in and gave nothing back. There was a man with a weathered face who looked as if he had learned to be loyal to the wrong things and kept learning and could not stop. There was a smuggler with honest hands. There was a boy with yellow eyes. There were banners enough to suggest a king, and food not enough to feed his horse properly. They parleyed between the outer and inner gates, where a man's words go up and strike stone and come back to hit him in the face if he does not speak carefully. Bran wore a cloak and a pin and had a knife on his lap that he had never had cause to use. He had 3 men at his shoulders and 1 wolf at his side. Howland stood to his right. Mira stood to his left. Stannis looked at him with eyes that did not blink much. "You are young," he said. "The snow is old," Bran said. Stannis's mouth made a very small move that might have been amusement if he had been another man. "You are Bran Stark." "I am," Bran said, and the words were not as heavy as he had feared. They fitted. "You have taken back this castle from traitors and oathbreakers. You have done what men twice your years were too slow to think of or too proud to attempt. You have my regard." Stannis did not lift his chin when he said it. He did not need to. Regard from him lay flat as a plank, and men could either walk it or not. Bran did not smile. "I have done what the ground demanded." Stannis nodded once, as if a stone had said a thing he agreed with. "I am the king," he said, and the red woman behind him seemed to glow, though the sun did not. Perhaps it was only the way her hair treated light like a friend. "The north is mine by right as the rest is. I will set you Lord of Winterfell with my own hand before we ride south to put a traitor's head on a spike. I will restore your lands and names and take oath and give oath. I will make your name weighty again under my crown. Kneel." Mira's breath went out in a white cloud that looked like a laugh but was not. Howland's eyelids drooped. In the silence, a crow somewhere on the wall, arrogantly, made a sound like a rusty hinge and mocked everything it could not understand. Bran looked down at his hands. They were boy's hands. He looked at the stone under them. It was not a boy. He looked at the men on the wall and the women at the well and the boy near the gate who had a smear of tallow on his cheek because he had been set to trimming a candle and had forgotten to wipe it away. He looked at Stannis, who looked back unblinking, his hunger wrapped around his righteousness like twine. "My lord," Bran said, not kneeling, "I do not think crowns sit well on men made of stone. They slip. I will take your oath if it is given to the north and not to me alone. I will give you aid in men and in grain as we have it, because the dead do not ask if a man is king before they kill him. I will not kneel today in the snow. I will not kneel until my brother Jon Snow stands beside me or until my brother Rickon comes home. I am not a whole cloth. I am only a patch held to the land by a name. I will take no southern swords P. Ramus that forgets the long night comes from the north. I will be a Stark for the north, not a lord for your paper. If you wish to make me a lord, it will be for what I do, not for what a crown says of me." The red woman's eyes flickered. Stannis's did not move. Behind him the smuggler tilted his head very slightly, and a half-smile tugged the corner of his mouth as if a memory had touched him. The boy with yellow eyes blinked slow and long as a cat. Stannis drew in breath and let it out and said, "You will learn that bending is not the same as breaking." "I learned that in the marsh," Bran said. "Bending is how reed men live. Breaking is for fools." And that was how Winterfell stood. A boy's hand on stone, a wolf in snow, a woman of the marsh with a spear, and a king who understood winter in numbers better than in feeling. It was not the last parley. It was a beginning of a kind a man in a hall would not call a beginning because there had been no feast, no swords laid over a table. But Bran had learned that beginnings were often muddy and smelled of eel, and of old blood, and of iron that had been heated and hammered and dipped in troughs that steamed. News came and news went. Men told Bran the umbers were split still, but the crack was a little wider on a certain side. Men told him a fry had slipped on the steps at White Harbor and broken his neck, and men who had eaten too much rich food laughed until someone told them to control themselves. Men told him a ship had put out from the far shore of Skagos with a boy and a wolf on it, and Bran went very still and did not let his heart throw itself out of his chest as if it could fly to the horizon on a thought. Men told him Stannis had moved again, as if the wind had turned for him and he had tacked like a good captain to use it. Men told him of crowds shouting for a queen somewhere south where the air smelled like spices and old stones warmed in the sun. Men told him Jon had been struck down, and then told him that Jon had stood up again with a face that had learned a lesson about death and had decided to give it back to the teacher. The stories contradicted one another, as stories do while the truth is still deciding what it is. Bran sat with Summer in the Godswood on a night when the cold was delicate rather than cruel, and when the stars above the branches were points of white that looked very near. He put his hand on the tree. He felt the feeling he had felt before. Not the dragging that had tried to pull him into roots, but the answering stone in him that said, "Here." He thought of the bowl in the cave and the old man with winter in his bones and the singer whose mouth had made shapes like leaves. He thought of choosing and of choosing again. "I refused them," he said softly, "because you speak softly in a Godswood, even if you are lord there. I stayed Bran." The tree did not reply in words. It gave him the water's sound and the smell of hot stone and the taste of old blood and sap. Summer pressed his head into Bran's thigh and sighed in that long wolf way. The night said nothing. The night was full of eyes. That was the comfort. The night saw him, and he saw it. And between them was a promise made not by crowns and seals and men with rings, but by a boy with his palm on stone and his name in his mouth. There would be more dead. There would be more snow. The South would go on being a place where men said the right words with the wrong music behind them. The North would remember. The reeds would bend. The trees would keep their choir under the earth. The wolves would run. Bran slept in his bed of furs and wool, wrapped more thickly than he had in years. And in the night he dreamed of a tower in a swamp with broken stairs where frogs sang, and an old secret waited down a flight he was not ready yet to take. He dreamed of a ship running before a wind with a wolf on its deck and a boy laughing because the spray was cold and he could taste salt. He dreamed of Jon on a wall of ice, a black cloak whipping, and a door in the dark that asked questions and took answers and decided for itself who was true. He dreamed of a girl with a sword in a far city smiling a terrible smile at men who had never imagined a small girl could contain such cold. He dreamed of his mother's hands and his father's voice and a feast where bread was broken and meat cut by knives that had been used for worse things and were redeemed by the sharing. He woke to the sound of water and the smell of stone and the feel of weight at the foot of his bed that was a wolf's head and breath. He reached down and set his hand between Summer's ears and felt the heat there like a hearth. He said aloud because there was no one to hear him but gods and wolves and sleeping men behind stone. "I am Bran Stark. I stayed." He lay back and smiled into the dark. When morning came, it did not come with trumpets. It came the way winter mornings come. Light pressed through cloud, smoke lifting steady, the sound of someone somewhere chopping wood and the slow creak of a gate that had decided to be kind. Bran threaded his arms into his sleeves and let his hand find the hilt of the knife, not because he expected to need it that day, but because it satisfied him to know that when he needed it he would remember where it was. He let Hodder lift him with that soft grunt that was love. He let Mira hand him his cloak and tie it with quick fingers. He let Howland look at him once, sharp and measuring, and then nod as if a tally had been made and come good. He went to the yard. Men were already there, moving the way men move in mornings when work waits for them. The yard smelled of horses and straw and breath. A boy dropped a pail and someone scolded him and then laughed because the pail had not broken the way it always had before, because someone had fixed its crack in the night with a clever stitch of bent iron. The things that make a castle are not stone and banners alone. They are the way sound behave. Yes, in the morning, and the way men spend their strength, and the way women set their mouths when they need dough. Bran rolled to the inner gate where the wall watch would come to relieve the men who had watched the night. He lifted his face to the cold and tasted coming snow. He thought it tasted like work. He smiled. He would not be a tree, rooted and dreaming while men froze in the dark. He would be a boy until he had to be a man, and then he would be that too. He would listen to the trees and to the stones and to the frogs and to the wind and most of all to the people who had come to stand under his walls and had put their lives in the shape of his name. He would carry all of it because that was what his name demanded, and he had decided to take it for his own instead of letting it be only a gift laid in his lap. He would make of himself a place where men could set down their knives without fear for a few heartbeats. He would make of himself a winter fire. When the raven came from the east with a strip of seaweed tied to its leg for a joke, and with it a note written in a hand Bran did not know at first, saying only, "We have him, ship running fair, boy fierce as his wolf." Bran took it to the godswood and read it under the red leaves and did not cry because the leaves were crying for him already. He laughed instead, and the laugh sounded like a boy's laugh. He let it be. He would be a boy as long as he could, and when the time came to be more, he would carry the boy with him into the man and not let that boy become a root. He would be Bran Stark. He had refused the river's sea and found a frost that held him fast enough for work and soft enough for love. He had said no to one tree to say yes to many. He would go on saying yes and no until the world's questions ran out. When night fell, it did not fall like a hammer. It crept in like mist, and then the stars burned holes in it, and then the moon came to visit the snow and make it shine. The wolves sang, and men listened, and some men shivered and did not know why, and others smiled and did not say the reason out loud because reasons are cheapened by being told too often. Bran lay awake a while and listened to and thought of a future where the dead would come and be answered by the living in steel and fire and wits and patience, and thought of a spring where the water in the moat would sing and frogs would return to it and boys would swim and their mothers would scold them. He thought of bread with butter and salt. He thought of hands held. He slept, and in his sleep the trees did not pull him away from himself. They sang in voices that had no words and no music, simply the sound of being old and still green. He slept and he stayed. He knew in his bones that in the morning he would rise and begin the work again. That was enough. For now, that was everything.